Bismillah, alhamdulillah. In this chapter, we're going to look at some alternatives to water-based purification, namely tayammum. Of course, we talked about wudu and ghusl previously in other classes. Now we're going to talk about this alternative. An alternative, one might say, well, wiping over the khuf, wiping over the imamah, the turban, the khimar, wiping over a cast or a splint is also an alternative. So why not mention all of that here in this chapter as well, in this particular section of this chapter? And that would be a great question. However, the answer to that is that wiping over such items is intricated into the part of wudu. It's intricated into the process of wudu. Whereas tayammum, it can serve as a standalone alternative. It can be integrated, which we'll look at shortly, but it is a standalone alternative to making wudu or ghusl. And so we find that it's arranged in such an order that you talk about wudu, you talk about ghusl, and then you talk about tayammum. And wiping over the khuf, etc. is somewhere up there in between. Linguistically, tayammum means intent. Legally, it means wiping of the face and hands with pure earth in a specific manner. It is a legislated act according to al-ijma' or consensus and can be found in the Quran. Multiple ayat. One of those in Surah An-Nisa, verse number 43, basically means, and if you cannot find water, then purify yourselves with clean earth, wiping your faces and hands. It's also proven in a hadith collected by Imams Abu Dawud and An-Nasa'i. The Prophet ﷺ said clean earth is a means of ablution for a Muslim, even if water is unavailable for 10 years. But when you find water, you should make it touch your skin, meaning purify yourself with that water. And it was ordained as an obligatory alternative in the 6th year of the Hijrah calendar. So to jump right into this babun fit tayammum, Imam Mansur al-Bahuti, he says, التيمم بدل عن طهارة ماء عند عجز عنه شرعا فإذا دخل وقت فرض أو أبيح نفل وعدم الماء أو زاد على ثمنه كثيرا أو خاف باستعماله ضرر بدنه أو رفيقه أو بهيمة محترمة تيمم. خير. Tayammum, he says, is unique. Of course, we need to understand it's unique to the Muslim community. Tayammum as a replacement for water-based purification. It's unique to the Muslim Ummah. Tayammum was not legislated for previous nations. This is, of course, from Allah's generosity He shows and showers upon us as Muslims. Al-Bahuti says it's a replacement for water-based purification, and it permits everything which can be done after using water, such as prayer. So, I mean, the alternative, it's exactly that. You can do what water would typically permit through wudu or ghusl, such as prayer, tawaf, prostrations of gratitude and recitation. That's sujud, shukr, and tilawa. Okay, reciting the Quran, touching the mushaf, etc. When the usage of water is either physically unavailable or legally impossible. This is important because it describes the scenario in which this can be done. When it can serve as an alternative. When it's either unavailable or legally impossible, even if it's physically possible. Physically possible meaning the water's there. You could technically do it, but there's a legal excuse. And this includes when water is unavailable as well as any legitimate scenario when it is present but cannot be used. Okay, so that's what we need to understand about legally impossible. Either the water's unavailable or there's an excuse to avoid using it. If it is legally possible to use water, it's not permissible to make tayammum. That's a key. And I think that's standard. I think that's common knowledge that if you can use water, it is available. You can't just make tayammum instead. You say, I don't feel like getting wet. I don't feel like messing up my hair. I don't feel like taking off these thin work socks. I don't feel like rolling up my sleeves. I don't want to have to, whatever, for whatever reason. You say, I'll just make tayammum. No, that can't happen. It's not permissible to make tayammum if it is legally possible to use water. As an obligation, tayammum can be performed as a resident or while traveling, regardless the nature of that travel. If you're wondering, why is that important? Think about the concession of wiping over the socks as a traveler on a journey of sin, and you'd understand the difference. Remember, that's a concession, a rukhsa, whereas tayammum is considered azima. That's a concession. This is an obligation in the event that water is legally impossible to use. Okay, so those types of things aren't considered. 2 conditions must be met to permit tayammum: entrance of the time and legal inability, when it's legally impossible. This means that tayammum cannot be made for an obligatory prayer or a time-specific recommended prayer until the time enters. It is also impossible to make it for a general voluntary prayer during a prohibited time until that prohibited time expires. Unless, of course, it's an exceptional prayer, like tawaf, 2 rakas of tawaf. Right? We know that there are a number of exceptional prayers that can be performed during prohibited times. Otherwise, you have to wait until the voluntary prayer time enters, which means the prohibited time has come to an end. It is valid for a missed prayer whenever it is remembered and desired to be made up. Basically, that's the time for a missed prayer. For an eclipse prayer when it becomes present. For a rain prayer when the people gather for the rain prayer. For a funeral prayer after the body has been purified. For Eid when the time enters. And for a time-specific oath prayer when that time begins. And it is valid at any time for a general oath prayer. The legal inability applies to both resident and traveler and includes scenarios such as being withheld from water due to confinement or imprisonment. A person may be bound and tied up. The water may actually be there, they're just being withheld. Or water is being withheld. If the water is available, you just don't have access to it. And that may be because you're blocked by something. It could be an enemy, it could be a wild animal, it could be something harmful standing between you and that water. There could be a fire, there could be a number of things. Or that it's just generally unavailable. So these are the 2 conditions that are mentioned. And in al-Muntaha, there's a 3rd condition that has to do with the actual earth itself. Just as a side note. Imam al-Bahuti goes on and he says, if the time for an obligatory prayer or a voluntary prayer associated with a specific time begins, or a voluntary prayer is permitted, and this is due to the end of a prohibited time of prayer, and there is no water, as described above, right, when it's impossible, those scenarios, and there is no water, and its price has become exorbitant, its price has become exorbitant, meaning it's gone way beyond market value, to the point that paying for it or the means to retrieve it would result in financial harm, would require a loan, or would leave you unable to fulfill basic financial obligations. So this is one of the excuses. If water's available, it's just cost too much. Or the retrieval of it just costs too much. I have to dig a well. I can't afford to dig the well. I have to have it shipped and trucked. I can't afford to do that. So here's an indication that if the only way that you could make wudu is to obtain water through purchase, you're obliged to do so so long as the price is not beyond your grasp. Or, right, there could be other scenarios like needing the water for drinking. You have a limited supply of water. You're out on a ship, you're traveling, you don't have access to water, and so what you do have needs to be consumed. In this event, you would make tayammum. Or that it may be physically harmful, like exacerbating a wound or an illness or delaying recovery. Or it could harm one's honorable companion or valued animal. Right? They need it to drink in order to survive, and you using it for wudu or ghusl would put them in harm's way. This includes like even a hunting dog. It's your animal. It's not just your horse or your camel, but it could even be your hunting dog. Right? It's a valued animal. And so by depriving them of that water, they may be thrown into harm's way. In this case, tayammum can be made. What we're talking about, an honorable companion, is somebody that is like, let's just put it this way, not like an adulterer or an apostate or a combatant, or when it comes to animals, not like a predatorial animal, like something impermissible. In that event, you're not required to save the water for their consumption, right? You can use the water. Imam al-Bahuti says, وَمَنْ وَجَدَ مَاءً يَكْفِي بَعْضَ طُهْرِهِ اسْتَعْمَلَهُ ثُمَّ تَيَمَّمَ وَالْجَرِيحُ يَغْسِلُ الصَّحِيحَ وَيَتَيَمَّمُ لِمَا يَضُرُّهُ الماء مرتبا متواليا في حدث أصغر ويجب طلب ماء في رحله وقربه ومن رفقته وبدلالة بلا ضرر قبله فإن نسي قدرته عليه وتيمم أعاد. Whoever finds enough purifying water for a partial purification, whether that's for wudu or ghusl, meaning there's only enough water to do a part of that process, they must use it before making tayammum. And this is based on the hadith found in Sahih al-Bukhari, which the Prophet ﷺ, he says, if I order you to do something, do whatever you can. إِذَا مَرْتُكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ فَاتُّهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Basically, if I order you to do something, then you do what is within your ability. And so it's therefore not valid to make tayammum until that water that's present is exhausted in wudu or in ghusl. And this is also understood from the verse that I mentioned previously. If you cannot find water, then purify yourselves with clean earth. So using the water first is considered when determining the lack of its availability. So while you even have a little bit of water, guess what? You have water, it's available. So that has to be consumed in the process of purification first before it can be unavailable so that you are permitted to make tayammum. It's also a determining factor of what tayammum is being made for. This next point is quite interesting. It's an example of this. When one is in the state of janaba and they only have enough water to wash the limbs of wudu. Okay, they're in a state of janaba. Say both. There's a major and a minor hadith. They only have enough water to wash the limbs of wudu. What should they do? They are to wash those limbs with the intent to remove both major and minor hadith and then make tayammum for what remains. Say by doing so, a complete purification for the minor hadith and a partial purification for the major hadith with water will have been achieved. And this, by the way, is what Umar ibn al-Khattab did in a very similar case. Another scenario is if one also needs to remove najasa from the body, they are to do that first and then make tayammum, unless the najasa is on a part of the body needed to wash to complete purification. In that case, the water is used with the intention of both washing the limb required for wudu and removing the filth. Washing filth from the body also takes precedence over washing filth from the clothes or the place of prayer. In the event that you have some water and there's just najasa spilled on your clothes, it's on your body, it's on the place of prayer, you only have enough water to wash one of those, you have to pick the najasa that's on the body. And we'll discuss how to deal with najasa on the clothes and on the place of prayer, because tayammum cannot be made for those things. So this, the previous scenario in which you have some najasa on the body, obviously you're going to begin with that, unless, for example, it's on your arm, right? It's on your arm, not your clothes. It's on the actual skin. So what you're going to basically do is similar to what we did before with the ghusl, is we're going to incorporate the washing of that najasa in the wudu process so that it happens together with the intent of doing both at the same time. And then when we would have used the water, that was just enough water to, wash the limbs, and in the process we removed that najasa. So we couldn't basically what's being alluded to is you shouldn't remove the najasa with that water first, leaving yourself without enough water to complete the water-based purification when you could use it for both in the same process, basically. Moving on from there, meaning some of the excuses, he says, similarly, the injured suffering from an injury on only part of the body. Okay, now we're making decisions on what we have to do when we use the water and when we do not. When do we make tayammum? He says they are to wash what is healthy and make tayammum for what will be harmed by water. Sequence and continuity must be observed in the case of a minor hadith. This is important here. If you're making tayammum due to a wound, and the tayammum is being used as a water-based alternative in wudu, okay? It's important that you maintain all of the integral parts of that, including sequence and continuity, which means that tayammum must be made at the typical time when the unhealthy part would be washed. Essentially what we're saying is that tayammum cannot be delayed until the water-based purification is made for the healthy limbs, basically until after that happens. So go back to the arm example. If there's a wound on my arm which prevents me from putting water on it, and I need to make wudu, okay, I'm going to make tayammum for this, obviously, but when do I make tayammum? I have to begin wudu, washing the healthy parts, okay, and I go through the process. And then when I get to the part where I wash my arms, then I'm going to wash the healthy parts, and then I'm going to make tayammum for this, and then I'm going to continue in the wudu process. Essentially, I'm not going to delay that tayammum to the end. I don't make wudu, skip this wounded area, and then make tayammum, because that puts it out of sequence. So in the event that the wound was on the head, okay, and I couldn't get it wet, I'm going to start making wudu. I'm going to wash my face, etc., etc. And then when I get to the head part where I would normally wipe, I'm going to wipe over the healthy part. I'm going to make tayammum, and then I'm going to continue the wudu process until I conclude it. So here's kind of some intricate details to that type of scenario, in what comes first and what comes next, etc. So listen to this example. If the injury encompasses the entirety of the face, tayammum is made first, and then the remaining limbs are washed. If it only covers a part of the face, either tayammum for part of the face can be made and then the healthy part washed, or the healthy part washed first and then tayammum is made for the wounded part. Okay? Basically, what we're talking about is is there a sequence to one limb? Sequence is understood as moving from one limb to the next. It's not understood that there's a sequence to washing the face. A required sequence to washing the arms, for example, from up to and including the elbow all the way to the end of the hand. We've discussed this in the section on wudu as to should we wash the right, left, and then or the left first. Should we go right then left, or left then right? Does that really matter? Should I wash from the top to the bottom, or the bottom to the top? So basically what we're saying is, with the example of the face, is if the wound is on a part of the face and the other part's healthy, you could do either or. Make tayammum first and then wash the healthy part, or wash the healthy part and then make tayammum, and the same thing goes for the other limbs, because sequence doesn't apply to an individual limb. Sequence only applies when moving from one limb to the next. Another kind of scenario would be, here, listen to this. So if the healthy part of the face was washed and then only one tayammum was made for the wound of the face and another wound on the hands, it would not be sufficient. So basically what you're essentially trying to do is you wash the healthy part of the face, you have a wound here, you can't get wet, and then you're going to move to your arms. There's a wound there, you can't get wet. So instead of making tayammum and then washing the healthy part of the arms and making tayammum again, you're basically going, hey, look, I'm going to combine the tayammum of the face with the arms and then carry on. And that is not sufficient, because they're two different limbs. You have to complete one limb before moving on to the next. You have to complete the purification of one limb. And in this case, that requires you to wash the healthy part and make tayammum for the unhealthy part. And when you go to the arms, that requires you to wash the healthy part and make tayammum for the unhealthy part. That's how you manage a complete purification of the limbs in sequence. You can't combine things in this process. So basically, what ends up happening is, if you had multiple wounds, like all over your body, wal-iyadhu billah, you had a terrible accident, there's a wound on your face, your arms, your head, your feet, you would end up having to wash the healthy parts and make tayammum for the unhealthy parts that couldn't get wet, and it would be like making multiple tayammums throughout the wudu process. Okay, and a person couldn't go, well, I just don't want to go there, I'm just going to make tayammum for everything. Remember, the water's available. Those parts of the body that are healthy can get wet. And so the standard protocol is to wash. And because you're not prevented from doing that, you know, a little bit of hardship is not preventing you. It's your own decision here, which say your nuffs may be getting in the way. But that is not a legal excuse to just simply try and suffice yourself with tayammum, even though you can. You're banged up, of course. I mean, you definitely need some compassion. But in this case, you have to fulfill these obligations. Another element to this is that wudu that was just described, where it's a mixture of washing the limbs and making tayammum. So both the wudu and the tayammum, because of the requirement of sequence and continuity, are invalidated when the time expires. And basically the invalidation here, or them being voided, is because of continuity specifically. Continuity, if you remember, is the time between washing or purifying the limbs from one to the next. Obviously, the sequence is going in order, and continuity means it's done in an expedient manner, so that one limb doesn't dry before the other one is washed, or what would be equivalent to washing or drying of that time. So basically, what will have happened is, back to the example with our arm, is if you've gone through the process correctly, you stop to make tayammum to deal with the wound on the arm, and you finish your wudu, you're good, and you can carry on with what you need to do in that state of purification. But tayammum is time-based, and so when the time expires, that tayammum that you made is invalidated. And because you need continuity, you have now lost. There will have been too much time between when it was addressed and now, so you couldn't go back and touch up your tayammum. You couldn't go back and touch up, start from there and move forward. Okay, that would have been too much time to have expired. This is the case for a minor hadith because of the continuity issue. Of course, that's not the case for a major hadith. All you made tayammum for in that mixture process was because of a major ritual impurity like janaba, sexual impurity. This is not the case. Sequence and continuity are not required. And therefore, washing the healthy part of the body and tayammum for the wounds can be done in any order, even if they are delayed. So the water-based portion of that process is only invalidated is only invalidated when something is done to invalidate it, and it's not invalidated due to time running out. Remember, wudu and ghusl they're not time sensitive. They have their own nullifiers. But what is time sensitive is the tayammum that you made for the wounded parts of the body. So in this scenario, very different from the first, the only thing that would be required to regain your state of purity is to make tayammum for the wound again. Basically now, is to touch up that purification process. You got to go back and make tayammum. You made the ghusl and you washed the body. That's taking care of that. The tayammum has expired. The ghusl that was washed did not. You didn't do anything from that time until now to have invalidated your ghusl. Before making tayammum, if we go back to the text here, before making tayammum, it is obligatory upon entrance of each prayer's time, at the entrance of the prayer time, that water be sought at home, close by, in all directions, from a friend, a neighbor, someone close by. You're going to ask them for potential water sources, or if you can purchase water from them, or with a trustworthy guide, so long as no real harm will be incurred, or the potential of real harm. Right? And if you don't do that, tayammum is invalidated. It's invalid to make it. If you don't do that, it's invalid to make it. So you have to go through this exercise of trying to locate water. And that has to happen once the time for prayer enters. If you're looking for it and you're going through this process before the time enters, it does not have any impact and it does not count. Imam al-Bahuti says if one makes tayammum having overlooked their ability to find some, or has forgotten a place where water could be retrieved or used, they must repeat it. meaning they must repeat the prayer. They have to make wudu or ghusl with the water that they forgot about, or overlooked their ability that, hey, I could actually go get that, it's not too far away. Or this would be like making tayammum and finding water in your house or an obvious water source close by. You make tayammum, you pray, then you all of a sudden you find like, hey, wait a minute, yeah, there's water right under the cupboard here. So you make wudu with the water if that's what you need, or ghusl, and then you have to pray. Something that's easy to do, right? In this case. And basically you're having to redo it because of your own negligence. You forgot about it. You overlooked their ability, or you forgot where the water was, and then you were able to get it. If it's not easy, if it's not something easy to do, then no, you don't have to repeat. He goes on and he says, وَتَيَمَّمُوا لِكُلِّ حَدَثٍ وَلِنَجَاسَةٍ بِبَدَنٍ تَضُرُّهُ إِزَالَتُهَا وَلَوْ حَضَرَ أو عُدِمَ ما يزيلها بعد تخفيفها ما أمكن ولا إعادة. It says here, tayammum is made for every type of hadith, be it major or minor, of course, due to unexcused impurity on the body. So this is why we're making tayammum. It's a hadith, or it is impurity on the body. Unexcused, meaning we're not talking about the traces of najasa that would be left behind after istijmar. Or other small trace elements here that are overlooked, and we'll see some of those in the next chapter about removal of impurities. So you don't make tayammum for those excused impurities. You make tayammum for the unexcused impurities that are on the body, which will cause harm if removed, even if the harm is due to cold in the presence of water, which cannot be warmed. Again, here's another kind of, or hinting at the fact that, look, if the water is cold and you can warm it up, meaning it would harm you to use it as cold and you can warm it up, then you have to warm it up. If you can't warm it up, then, now you have an excuse. Or in the absence of what will eliminate it after as much najasa as possible has been removed. Meaning the water must be exhausted, even if it cannot remove all of the najasa on the body before tayammum is made. And if there's no water, as much of the najasa must be removed by rubbing it or scratching it, picking at it, removing it in any way possible before making tayammum. And repetition is thus not required in this case. So here we're essentially talking about how to deal with najasa on the body. What would permit you to make tayammum for najasa on the body? If it was too harmful to remove it, then you can make tayammum. Even if water was present, it was just too harmful for you to remove it, you can make tayammum. Or there was no water. Then you would have to remove what you could. I mean, it wouldn't have been ritually purified, but you would get most of it off the body. And that means like using tissue or paper or whatever. We obviously know it takes water to clean the body from najasa, but you would use something, cloth or paper or a rock or dirt or a stick or something, remove it from the body as much as you can. It's going to leave behind something. And then, because water is unavailable, you make tayammum. And if you do this, repetition of the prayer is not required. He goes on and he says, فَإِنْ عَدِمَ الْمَاءُ وَالتُّرَابُ صَلَّ الْفَرْضَ فَقَدْ عَلَى حَسَبِ حَالِهِ وَلَا يَزِيدُ عَلَى مَا يُجْزِئُ وَلَمْ يُعِدْ ولا يصح تيمم إلا بتراب طهور مباح له غبار لم يغيره طاهر غيره ولو على لبد ونحوه. Khair, in this next little section here, he says if neither water nor earth are available, basically to someone who wishes to pray while they are in a state of ritual impurity, and so this would be an example like being withheld or imprisoned, or they're too ill, they can't use the water because they need it for consumption. And of course they don't have, so now you're dealing with a scenario where you don't have the water and you don't have turab, you don't have earth. So you're legally excused from using the water, and then turab, you might be held or captive or imprisoned, or you're bound or something to where you can't even access pure earth. So one is to pray what is obligatory as they are. Without the ability to purify themselves, they pray what is required of them to pray, not exceeding what will suffice their prayer. Basically here now we have to understand some issues of prayer. What is the minimum requirement of prayer? Because we didn't purify ourselves, we're going to just maintain the minimum standards of prayer. Okay, so that basically means no opening supplication, there's no seeking refuge, there's no basmala, there's no ameen, there's no recitation of an additional surah after al-Fatiha, there's no making tasbih or seeking refuge more than once, nothing else beyond the minimum requirement. And because that scenario, it's not required to repeat. It's not required to repeat the prayer afterwards. Like, now I've been freed, I can have access to water or dirt, I need to go back and make up my prayers. No, you basically fulfilled your obligations to the best of your ability. They're fulfilled, they're gone. He goes on here and he says, it is invalid to make tayammum with anything other than purifying permissible dusty earth. This is important here, dusty earth. This is something that's integral to this process, such that the dust sticks to the hand. Even if found on wool or a wall or a carpet, a tree, or even an animal, meaning there's enough dirt, there's enough earth on these objects that when you come in contact with them, dust will cling to the hand. Okay? That means, like, it's a mud wall. It's obviously made of earth, but it's solidified. And if you were to put your hand on it, even to strike it, if there's no dust on the hand, then we have to find another source. Okay, that's important. An important part here is that the dust sticks to the hand. Now, if that earth wall would produce dust on the hand when struck, then obviously it could be used. Otherwise, no. Or if it was in carpet or wool, there was enough earth, it was a dirty enough surface, like an animal that had just rolled around in the dirt, your horse or your camel or something, and you struck that animal, and then there was dust from earth that came off of it onto the hands, it's permissible to use that. Of course, that dust or that earth, which has not been changed by something else pure, right? That is dust, and in an amount such that it becomes overwhelming, meaning that the change has become overwhelming by something else that has dust, and that dust is mixed in there and it has overwhelmed it. And this is based on the verse, and if you do not find water, then seek clean earth and wipe over your faces and your hands. Now, Abbas said that Sa'id here, this is getting down to the nitty gritty of what the substance actually is. Like, can we use sand? We're talking about like clay or what? So Ibn Abbas, he said that Sa'id means turab. This is the word that's used in the verse. It means turab, which is dirt of tillable land. This is like earth. It's like soil, okay? And tayyib means pure. This is supported by the hadith of Ali, which states, and the turab, or the dirt, has been made a purifier for me. It's collected by Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad. Therefore, it's not valid to use sand, plaster, or crushed rock, okay? Like taking a rock and just grinding it all the way down until it's powdery or dusty. The rock is not called turab, nor is sand. Sand is not called, pure sand is not called turab. And so those terms are not applied to this material, therefore it cannot be used. It's also not valid to use dirt that has been stripped of its purifying state, such as dirt used for tayammum. This is similar to the used water of wudu. If we were to try and collect all of the dirt that came off people's hands that made tayammum and then reuse that, kind of recycle that, then no, this has been stripped of its purifying quality. The thing is, because it must have dust, it cannot be wet. That's another thing to consider, like using dirt, like wet dirt or like mud. Remember, the dust has to be there. So mud, it's not going to be dusty. It's just going to have a clobber of mud on your hand. And in this case, what you would do is you would dry it out. And you would do that so long as the time didn't run out, the time for prayer. Obviously, if it was going to take too long to dry it, then you would have to pray as you were in that particular state. And this concludes the introduction to Tayammum.